Welcome to an introduction to the Talmud especially designed for ladies. I have no idea what that means because I will present to you this introduction regardless of what your gender is. I mean, it won't make a difference. The only reason why we marketed it, so to speak, for women over men is because there's an assumption, whether correct or not is up for you to tell me, that there's less familiarity with Talmud study among women than there is among men. Just because it's not part of the regular curriculum in many schools, at least not for the people that are in this room when you were growing up, when I was growing up, it was not part of the day school or yeshiva, high school, or seminary curriculum. Was it for you? Okay. Okay.
Not only was it not, but if you did it privately, you were looked down on.
There was something wrong with you.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. So, there is this concept that is a tradition in many circles within the Jewish world that women should not be studying Gemara. And it's based on the fact that the Gemara says, Kol hamelamed es bito Torah ki ilu melamda tiflus, that if you teach your daughter Torah, and here the understanding is Torah Shebe'al Peh, you're teaching her folly. And there are a number of different interpretations for that, which is really not the objective of our class to discuss what the interpretations are. But my tradition is, from my Rosh Yeshiva, that that's when you coerce a woman to study Talmud by making it a required form of a part of her curriculum. But if a woman would like to study, a young lady would like to study Talmud, and she comes and says, we want to study this, then there's no reason, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to restrict the study of Torah Shebe'al Peh in any form for either men or women. And so that's what gives rise to this introduction. What our plan is, and this is where you see on the top of your page, is that week number 1, our objective is to define and provide the history of what Torah Shebe'al Peh is. The Talmud is one sort of result or one format of Torah Shebe'al Peh. Week 2 that'll be next Tuesday night. We'll go over what's called the Tzuras Hadaf, which is, we're going to show you a page of Talmud. We'll show you what it looks like. We'll show you what all of the different margins are all about, what is in the bold text and what is in the Rashi text. And then we'll talk a little bit about hermeneutical methodology, wherein we will discuss some of the methods of discussion and how the Gemara extracts both Jewish law and Agada from Psukim in Tanakh. Week 3 will go through vocabulary and linguistic style. Week 4 and week 5 will both be practicums, where we'll actually be studying texts of Gemara, and we'll break you up into chavrusa, and we'll have you study with each other. And you'll have to do a laning, which, you know what a laning is? A laning is a preparation of a piece of Gemara. And you'll break you up into chavrutas. Week 4 will be a practicum on the halachic section of Gemara. And week number 5 will be a practicum on an agadic section of Gemara. And we'll explain the difference between the halachic and the agadic portions of Talmud. Okay? So why don't we get started? What we want to try and do is explain what the Talmud is, with the assumption, I know that many of you already have a familiarity with these topics, but I'm going to assume that there are at least some of you, who don't know any of these terminologies or are not familiar with them, and I want to try and carefully define them as best as I can. When the Jewish people stood at Har Sinai, we received 2 Torahs. We received a written Torah, that we have clearly the text of. It is the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. And we also received an oral Torah, which is the commentary, or sort of filling in the lines, to the Torah Shebe'al. So the written Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, we call Torah Shebe'al, the Torah that is in writing. And the other Torah, which was transmitted orally to Moshe, and we're going to see this transmission process very clearly in our text for tonight, is called Torah Shebe'al Peh, is an oral tradition. Now the truth is that when you think about it, any meaningful body of literature has to be transmitted both in the written form and also needs to be transmitted in the oral form. Can anyone think of a reason why it's necessary to preserve some level of orality in any body of literature that needs to be transmitted for several generations? Can anyone think of a reason why that would be? Please.
If people aren't literate?
Well, you might have some people who aren't literate, and therefore you can provide them with some aspect of teaching, even if they don't have accessibility to text. Yes?
Maybe there's some ambiguity to the written text, and the oral text can clarify that?
There will always be ambiguity in a written text, no matter how comprehensive that text attempts to be. There will always be portions which are open to interpretation and might be interpreted differently if all that is transmitted is written text. For example, let's say I tell you, you have a text, and in that text it says, "It's time to eat, Grandma." Someone else could interpret that as "It's time to eat, Grandma." And so you want to make sure that when you transmit that text faithfully, it is transmitted in such a way that eliminates the ambiguities of language. Okay? And that's the purpose of having an oral transmission. There's another purpose for oral transmission. Yes? Nancy.
Maybe a teacher-student relationship to build?
Exactly. Very good. Very much so. What Nancy says is very, very true, and that is that in order to preserve a relationship between one generation to the next, between the teacher to the student, you need to have some aspect of orality preserved in the transmission of information. When we send our children to school, the reason why we don't just give them a textbook is not because we can't come up with a perfect textbook, but it's rather because we believe in a pedagogical system whereby they will learn from another human being who will be giving them information, someone that they can look up to, someone that they can try and glean a more comprehensive type of wisdom than just that which is the subject at hand. And so that too was one of the objectives that it was accomplished through having part of our Torah literature transmitted orally. Now, if you say, okay, that's great, then what does that have to do with Talmud? So we're going to see that tonight. Where does Talmud fit in to the Torah Shebe'al Peh, to the oral transmission? So that's what we need to discover tonight. The first thing we're going to do is take a look at a Mishnah. The term Mishnah refers to a body of text that was composed sometime in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era, to the best of our estimates. And we're going to see the historicity of the Mishnah shortly when we look into the text of Maimonides, who tries to give us a full explanation of Torah Shebe'al Peh. But for now, it's important to know that this is a very abbreviated text that contains a massive amount of information in a very small number of words. When I say small number of words, it's a 6-volume text. And each volume of text contains a number of tractates, which is subject books. And each of the codes that are contained within the Mishnah, or the paragraphs that are contained within the Mishnah, contain a very voluminous amount of information abbreviated in a very small amount of text. The Mishnah, as we will see later on, is one of the two parts of the Talmud. Okay? The Mishnah is the earlier part of the Talmud, and the Gemara is the later part of the Talmud. So let's take a look at the text of this Mishnah, and all of our texts are going to be in English. But you see the original Hebrew text in the Mishnah. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Yehoshua, to Joshua, and Yehoshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. Now, what we're seeing here at face value is a statement of transmission of the Torah that was given to Moses at Sinai, and he later gave it to generations that came after him in a transmission process, all the way to the men of the great assembly. Now, who are these people? Who is Joshua? Well, we know from the Torah, Joshua was Moshe's disciple. Who are the elders? They are identified as a group of wise men who are assigned with leadership roles in the Bible also. And the prophets? Prophets are people that are mentioned in the Bible as well. Prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They too were part of this process of transmission. The only people that are difficult to identify are the men of the great assembly. Because we don't know who that is. It's a group of people who came about after the prophets. So we're going to need some guidance to define who these men of the great assembly. In Hebrew, they are known as Anshei Knesset HaGedolah. And of course, they said three things. Now, this is how Pirkei Avos begins. Now, Pirkei Avos, for those of you who have studied a little bit of the ethics of the fathers, know that it is a series of teachings on how to be an ethical human being. But the very first teaching of Pirkei Avos is a saying of the men of the great assembly. And they said, be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence for the Torah. Now I want you to, if you have a pencil or a pen, try to number those three things. Number one is be deliberate in judgment. Number two is raise up many disciples. And number three, make a fence for the Torah. I would like to be able to use this Mishnah as a springboard for our discussion of Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral tradition, because as we'll see, the oral tradition is a combination of both the preservation and transmission of an oral tradition, plus it contains within that tradition a sense of responsibility that in the course of preserving a tradition, you need to sometimes add precautionary measures to that transmission. In other words, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that if, let's say, there's a law that was passed down from my grandparents and from their grandparents to them, going back 1,000 or 2,000 years, if I see that that practice in my family is beginning to erode, I might be tempted to bolster that practice so that it will not erode any further. So, for example, let's say there's a tradition in my family that on the 1st of February of every year, we have a feast where every descendant of Grandpa Joe, great-grandpa Joe, has to come to the feast. And it could be that in years past, every single descendant of Grandpa Joe came to that feast on February the 1st. But years go by. There are more and more descendants of Grandpa Joe that have moved away from our community where we all grew up with Grandpa Joe. And some of them have moved to different countries, different continents even. And it's very difficult to be able to get them all together. but I find it very important to preserve that tradition. So I might feel a need to take certain precautionary measures in order to preserve the tradition. I might provide financial incentives to all of Grandpa Joe's descendants. I might impose a penalty that if you come to the party, you will receive something, but if you don't come to the party, you won't get it. Or I might, in other ways, create additional safeguards to make sure that that tradition of having a dinner every February 1st is upheld. So part of the process of transmission is that in generations that become more and more distant from the Sinai experience, there are additional safeguards that are placed upon some of our traditions in order to ensure that they will not erode any further. So you may be familiar with some of them. God said, do not cook a goat in its mother's milk. At one time, there was a detection that this practice was beginning to erode. And so the rabbis decided of one generation that they needed to reinforce this tradition. And so they added to this prohibition and said that you may not even cook poultry in milk. Not only is beef or lamb not permitted to be cooked in its mother's milk, but even a chicken who doesn't have any milk from its mother may also not be cooked together with milk. This is clearly not part of the biblical injunction. By all measures, the Torah does not prohibit us from cooking poultry in milk. It's very clear from the text. And the rabbis acknowledged that this is only an additional safeguard. This is not, we're not reinterpreting the Bible, but we're adding a safeguard to the Bible. It is in that context that I'd like you to look at the three statements of the men of the Great Assembly. Clearly, they are part of a link in a series of generational links that are passing the Torah from one generation to the next. And they seem to be living in a time where there is a beginning of an erosion of tradition. And it's for that reason that they said those three things. Be deliberate in judgment, which means whenever a question comes to you and it's not clear, either from our written text or from our oral tradition, what to do, you're going to have to decide. Because there are always going to be questions that come up that were not addressed by generations that came before you. And you, as a deliberating body of rabbinic leaders, are going to have to know how to answer a question that has never been posed before. So number one, be deliberate in judgment. Number two, raise up many disciples. Because when you live in a time where the transmission process is in a precarious state, the way to bolster that transmission is to create as many disciples as you can to ensure that the teachings disseminate far and wide and are not limited to a small group of people who receive the transmission. And the third is make a fence for the Torah. Don't just stay with the biblical prohibition of milk and meat, but sometimes you may find it necessary in order to stop the erosion of the process of transmission to add certain things and to create a fence, an extra border to make sure that the original laws are not violated. So therefore you may find that it's sometime necessary to prohibit things in addition to meat, and that's why chicken also may not be cooked with milk. So far, so good. Now we're going to take a look at a section from the Mishneh Torah, okay? And this is a book that was written in the 12th century, long after the period of the Talmud. And it was written by one of our greatest sages who ever lived in the medieval period. His name was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, or Maimonides, or, as he's also known, the Rambam, which is an acronym for Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. The Rambam undertook a project that had heretofore never been undertaken. And that is, he said, I am going to collect all of Jewish law, and I'm going to present it in codified form. Up until the times of Maimonides, Jews were practicing Jewish law, but they were doing it based on their knowledge of the Talmud, which we haven't yet defined yet what it is, we will, and based on the teachings from their teachers, how they were raised in the home. And the Rambam noted that there were different ways of interpreting what texts were available in his time, to the point where there was a lot of confusion already by the 12th century, even with the texts that were available. And so he decided to take all of the oral transmission that was available, that had already been, some of it had been committed to writing, and he said, it's written in such a way where it's difficult to understand, I'm going to codify everything. And in his work called the Mishneh Torah, he writes an introduction. The introduction to Mishneh Torah is an overview of the history of Torah Shebe'al Peh, because he wants us to know where he's getting his information from. Let's begin. He starts off, and by the way, I give you the link as to where you can find this text online. Then shall I not be ashamed when I look to all thy commandments, is a verse from the Psalms. Maimonides says, all the precepts which Moses received on Sinai were given together with their interpretation. As it is said, and I will give unto thee the tables of stone and the law and the commandment. The law refers to the written law, and the commandment to its interpretation. God bade us to fulfill the law in accordance with the commandment. The commandment refers to that which is called the oral law. So Maimonides begins by telling us that built into the text of the written Torah is an allusion to the orality of the explanations to the Torah, which we call Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral law. The whole of the law was written by Moses, our teacher, before his death, in his own hand. When he says the law, what he means is the Torah Shebichtav, the written Pentateuch. He presented a scroll to each tribe and deposited one in the ark for a testimony, as it is said, take this book of the law and put it by the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against thee. The commandment, which is the interpretation of the law, which means, in other words, this is what the mitzvah means, he did not write down, but gave a charge concerning it to the elders, to Joshua, and to the rest of Israel. As it is said, all this which I command you, that shall ye observe to do. Thou shalt not add thereto, nor diminish from it. Hence, it is styled, or it is called, the oral law. So let's just give a brief example. The Torah says, V'haya la'os al yadecha, u'letotafot beineinecha. It shall be, the Torah shall be for you a sign on your arm, and as totafot, which is usually translated as frontlets, between your eyes. Now, that's a very ambiguous sentence. What does that refer to?
Tefillin.
It refers to tefillin. Now, how do we know it refers to tefillin?
Torah Shebe'al.
That's the Torah Shebe'al Peh. That's the explanation that Moshe gave to Joshua and to the elders after him. And furthermore, how do we know what color the tefillin are? How do we know what shape they are? How do we know what they're supposed to be made out of? How do we know what goes inside of them? All of this was part of the oral transmission. Although the oral law was not committed to writing, Moshe taught the whole of it in his court to the 70 elders, as well as to Eleazar, Pinchas, and Yehoshua, all three of whom received it from Moses. To Joshua, his disciple, our teacher Moses delivered the oral law and charged him concerning it. So too Joshua throughout his life taught orally. Many elders received the oral law from Joshua. Eli, who was the Kohen Gadol in later years, received it from the elders and from Pinchas. Samuel from Eli and his court. David from Samuel and his court. Achiah the Shilonite was among those who had come forth from Egypt. He was a Levite and had heard the law from Moses in his childhood. He received the oral law from David and his court. And we're not going to go through the laborious list. And I just put in brackets, here the Rambam lists all the generations of oral law transmission from the prophets down through the Second Temple period, through the period of the Tanaim. I will tell you who the Tanaim are very shortly. Our teacher, the saint, that is a reference to Rabbi Judah Hanasi, compiled the Mishnah. And as I mentioned to you before, the Mishnah is a text that is compiled sometime in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era. The author is named, he calls him Rabbeinu, which is our master or our teacher. And he is referring to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the president, because at that time in Jewish history, the Jews who lived in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, had not only a rabbinic leader, but a political leader wrapped into the same person. That was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. It's very rare to be able to find a successful rabbinic leader and political leader. Just look at what's going on today, but I digress. Okay, but Rabbeinu compiled the Mishnah. From the time of Moses to that of our teacher, the saint, meaning Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, no work had been composed from which the oral law was publicly taught, meaning that there was no composition, there was no fixed text that one could refer to and call that the oral law. The oral law, by definition, was recited by different people in different words, because when you have an oral explanation, let's say we talk about tefillin. So Rabbi so-and-so would say, well, he would have his order of listing the tefillin. They have to be black, they're made out of leather, they have straps. And then another rabbi would say, they have straps, they're cubical, they're made out of leather, and he would have a whole different way of presenting the information. There is no uniform oral set of words that explain the mitzvot. But in each generation, the head of the then existing court or the prophet of that time wrote down for his private use a memorandum of the traditions which he had heard from his teachers and which he taught orally in public. So in every generation, everyone jotted down a few words, a few notes, kept them in his pocket, kept them in his library in his house. But they were not disorganized pieces of paper, not fixed into an accepted or canonized text. So too every student wrote down, according to his ability, the exposition of the Torah and of its laws, as he heard them, as well as the new matter evolved in each generation, which had not been received by tradition, but had been deduced by application of the 13 hermeneutical rules and had been adopted by the Supreme Court. This was the method in vogue till the time of our teacher, the saints. Now we need to just unpack that small paragraph because we've been introduced to some new information. The Rambam tells us that there's new information that was not transmitted, but which was derived by hermeneutical rules. Now, we're going to explain what those hermeneutical rules are. By the way, hermeneutics is a very fancy word that simply means a method of deriving or interpreting law. It's a method of interpreting law. When we talk about Talmudic hermeneutics, we refer specifically to a technique or methodology to take words from the Tanakh, and more specifically the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and infer Jewish law from those texts. Much of the law was transmitted orally, but when new questions came about, and the rabbis didn't know where to turn to because these issues had not been addressed before, they relied on hermeneutical keys that were transmitted along with the oral tradition. What those hermeneutical keys are, and how the rabbis are able to draw law from those hermeneutical keys, is something that we'll be discussing in week what? What week is that? That's next week. We're going to get to that next week. So therefore, there's an accumulation in each succeeding generation. In the earlier generations, all that was transmitted was the oral law as it had been explained from Moses to Joshua and from Joshua to the elders, etc. There were certain generations where there was added information based on hermeneutics, where if there was any ambiguity in the law, the rabbis of that new generation would apply hermeneutical rules in order to derive the law from the written Torah. And in order for that hermeneutical sort of extraction to be codified, or to be ratified, I should say, into law, it needed to be accepted by the Supreme Court. What do you call a Supreme Court in Hebrew? The Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin would adopt this when there was a centralized authority to ratify Jewish law. So up until now, we've explained how things worked up until the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Did the hermeneutical rules come down with the oral law from Har Sinai?
Correct. According to our tradition, there was a set of keys that were passed down.
Okay.
In other words, whenever, it's almost like getting the Da Vinci Code, right? In other words, like if you have this puzzle, and then all of a sudden you find this ancient parchment which tells you that this letter corresponds to that number, right? It's a code. So that's almost like what the hermeneutical keys were. It basically said when you're going to find a certain organization of words or a certain set of extraneous words in the Torah, here's what you're meant to do with them. And using those guidelines, the rabbis were able to extract law based on the unusual verbiage that they found in the Torah.
So then the teachers had to transmit the rules also.
That's right. That was part of the transmission process. We're going to learn some of those rules shortly. Yes?
What's the 13? There were 13 rules
Yes.
that were passed down.
Yes. Now that's according to one text that we have, which men say every single morning. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Bishloshes Remidos HaTorah Nidreshes Bahem. There are 13 hermeneutic keys that the Torah can be expounded upon with, or with which the Torah can be expounded. Okay, so let's talk about now the generation of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, our master. He gathered together all the traditions, enactments, interpretations, and expositions of every portion of the Torah that had either come down from Moses, our master, or had been deduced by the courts in successive generations. All this material he redacted in the Mishnah, which was diligently taught in public, and thus became universally known among the Jewish people. Copies of it were made and widely disseminated so that the oral law might not be forgotten in Israel. So this is the first time in the 2nd century of the Common Era that there is a fixed text that can be used as an aid to teach the oral tradition. By the way, that does not mean that there's a cessation of orality. It just means that we're taking a book, a relatively small book, that is written with tremendous economy of verbiage to help us remember a much larger body of information. Okay? Now, let's go on. Why did our teacher, the saint, act so and not leave things as they were? Because he observed that the number of disciples was diminishing, fresh calamities were continually happening, the wicked government was extending its domain and increasing in power, and Israelites were wandering and emigrating to distant countries. Right? He noticed persecution does a lot to really wipe out the desire to transmit information. Migration does a lot to erode a transmission. He therefore composed a work to serve as a handbook for all, and the contents of which could be rapidly studied and would not be forgotten. Throughout his life, he and his colleagues were engaged in giving public instruction in the Mishnah. This is what we call the Mishnah. Mishnah is that universal text that was the first text that was committed to public acceptance, universal acceptance, that had some sort of universally accepted text of the oral transmission. It is not the totality of the oral transmission, but it is a way of reminding us of a much larger body of information. Okay? The Gemara is quite, what's the word I'm looking for? It has mixed emotions. I don't remember the word I'm looking for. It's ambivalent. That's the word I was looking for. It's ambivalent about Rebbe's project, about Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi's project. Why is it ambivalent? Because on the one hand, we as a people are extremely hesitant to innovate anything that is revolutionary within the Jewish transmission process. If it ain't broke, you don't fix it. And even if it is somewhat broken, to revolutionize something that has been a certain way for centuries, we are loath to do so. Furthermore, the rabbis tell us that there was a well-accepted tradition that you're not supposed to convert the oral tradition into something written. And if so, Rebbe was committing a sin by committing this to a fixed text. And the Gemara therefore has to defend Rebbe's action by quoting a pasuk in Tanakh which says, Eit la'asot l'Hashem heiferu Toratecha. Sometimes you need to act for God when there is loosening of the Torah. And the Talmud explains it that when you live in a generation where there's a loose transmission process, where things have begun to erode, you have to act for God, even if it means further eroding in one area of the law, which is the law that you're not supposed to write it down. In other words, better to violate that one area of law so that you prevent the erosion of the totality of the law. And that was the justification that was offered for Rebbe's project. Now, I will tell you that if you want to be sleuths, if you want to be good detectives, I'll tell you where to find Rebbe's own ambivalence in his project. If you look in Pirkei Avot, you will discover that Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi is himself quoted in the Mishnah, which means that the man who wrote the Mishnah many times included his own statements. Not out of vanity, but especially in Pirkei Avot, Rebbe wanted to he said, listen, all of my forebears contribute their teachings and ethics, I shall contribute my teaching as well. And if you look carefully, it's contained in the second chapter of Pirkei Avot, you will be able to look at every single statement that he makes at the beginning of chapter 2 of Pirkei Avot and be able to derive his own ambivalence about what he felt he needed to do. But that's not for now. Okay. Among the sages who were members of our sainted master's court and received instruction in the oral law from him, the following were the most distinguished. His sons, Shimon and Gamliel, Rabbi Ephes, Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Hoshea. These were the most illustrious of the sages who received instruction from him, besides thousands and tens of thousands of other scholars. Although these 11 are named as having received instruction from our sainted teacher and attended his college, Rabbi Yochanan was a child at the time, and at a subsequent period a pupil of Rabbi Yanai from whom he received instruction. Rab also received instruction from Rabbi Yanai, as Samuel did from Rabbi Chanina, son of Chama. He's getting a little bit now into the names, so we're going to move a little bit faster. But then this next paragraph is very important. Rab compiled the Sifra and the Sifri. These are two other works that are not the Mishnah, but they are also formalized texts of portions of our oral tradition, the purpose of which is to expound and teach the principles of the Mishnah. So basically, the Sifra and the Sifri are known as halachic midrash. It is a genre of Talmudic text which is a commentary to the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and it derives law based on Rebbe's Mishnah, but attaching those laws to the actual psukim, the actual verses in the Torah. Rabbi Chia compiled the Tosefta to explain the subject matter of the Mishnah. This too is a body of text, which is fixed in its language, but is, again, not part of the Mishnah, but is composed a few years after the Mishnah. So too Rabbi Hoshea and Bar Kapara compiled Baraitas to elucidate the text of the Mishnah. Again, these are disciples of Rebbe who are adding to the texts of oral tradition beyond the Mishnah because they perceive that the Mishnah in certain parts may be too terse for everyone to properly understand it. So already in the generation after Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, there are additional texts that are being published by Rebbe's disciples in order to continue his own project, which is to create texts which will prevent the oral tradition from being forgotten. Rabbi Yochanan composed the Jerusalem Talmud in Palestine approximately 3 centuries after the destruction of the Second Temple. The Jerusalem Talmud is in contradistinction to the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud is written by one of Rebbe's disciples. It is therefore an older text than the Babylonian Talmud, which we're going to get to later. But the Jerusalem Talmud, too, is a text which is there to help explain and elucidate Rebbe's teachings that are contained in the Mishnah. The only difference between the Jerusalem Talmud and all of the other texts that we mentioned in this paragraph is that the Jerusalem Talmud is written by and large in Palestinian Aramaic, and it is a much more verbose text. It is a much longer text than the Sifra, the Sifri, the Tosefta, and the Braitas. Okay? The Rambam then lists the generations of transmission after the Mishnah, which we're not going to go through. And then the Rambam says, accordingly, counting back from Rav Ashi to Moses, our teacher, there were 40 generations of scholars who received the oral law, each from his predecessors in unbroken succession, as follows. And I will let you go through the list on your own. It is right there in the text in front of you. Let's turn the page to page 3. Any questions yet? Any questions at this point? Okay, let us go a little bit further. All the sages here mentioned were the great men of the successive generations. Some of them were presidents of colleges. Now, when we think about a president of a college, we're not talking about the dean of York University, right? We mean a Rosh Yeshiva, the head of a yeshiva, okay? Great rabbi. Some exilarchs. What is an exilarch? Anyone know what an exilarch is? It's a political leader in Babylon, which was under Persian rule at the time, and they allowed a semi-autonomous form of political governance for the Jewish community. The head of that, the leader of that semi-autonomous governing body of the Jewish community in Bavel, in Babylonia, was known as the exilarch, or in Aramaic, the Reish Galuta, the head of the exile. Okay? And some were members of the great Sanhedria, the great Supreme Court. Besides them were thousands and myriads of disciples and fellow students. We now fast forward to Ravina and Rav Ashi. These are 2 rabbis who close the list of the sages of the Talmud. Now this is done sometime in approximately the 5th century. It was Rav Ashi who compiled the Babylonian Talmud in the land of Shinar, which is the biblical name for Babylon, about a century after Rabbi Yochanan had compiled the Jerusalem Talmud. So now we're getting our first glimpse of what we today in the vernacular call Talmud, which is the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud contains within it the text of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, which we call what? The Mishnah. And then it contains the text of the Babylonian Talmud, which follows each Mishnah in sections to elucidate and explain and discuss further that which is contained in the Mishnah. And the question you may ask is, Rabbi Yochanan wrote a Talmudic commentary to the Mishnah in Jerusalem, or in Palestine, and Ravina and Ravashi, a century later, wrote their Talmudic commentary, known as the Babylonian Talmud, a commentary to the Mishnah, a century or more after Rabbi Yochanan. What do we study today by and large? What is the primary area of study in the yeshivas today? The Babylonian Talmud, Talmud Bavli. Why is that considered to be more authoritative? There are a number of reasons for this, and this is discussed both by scholars and by great rabbinic thinkers. The two main reasons are that in Bavel, the culture in Babylon was such that it was a much more edgy culture in society. And what I mean by edgy, it was like the difference between Canada and New York City. In other words, Eretz Yisrael, Palestine was like Canada, and Bavel was like New York City. So if someone would ask you for directions, he says, yeah, what do you want? I want directions. Yeah? Well, I'll give you directions, but first you got to... And then, it would create a lot of disputation and discussion. So that kind of edginess sometimes produces more robust discussions. And that's the reason why the Babylonian Talmud is considered to be more authoritative, because culturally, the rabbis in Bavel were more given to debates and disputations. And the more debates and disputations, the more likely you are to end up with a final resolution, believe it or not. When everyone is willing to agree, sorry, no, you go first, no, then it could be that the person with the loudest voice is the one who decides what the rules are. And you're not necessarily getting the most accurate conclusion.
Oh, we're more respectful.
They're more respectful, but they aren't necessarily the most correct. And that's the reason why Talmud Bavli is considered more authoritative. But another reason is because it is the later of the two texts. And there was, even though normally we give deference to earlier texts as a general rule, but it was accepted that there were certain issues that were undertaken in the Jerusalem Talmud that were still being debated a century later in the Babylonian Talmud, and sometimes issues which had not yet been fully resolved in the Jerusalem Talmud were debated further, and different conclusions were arrived at. And that's the reason why the Babylonian Talmud is considered to be more authoritative.
How did they come to the decision at what point to leave the Talmud Yerushalmi behind?
That's a very good question. It happened, the question is, at what point was the decision made to sort of make the Jerusalem Talmud, not to leave it behind so much, but rather to make it a secondary text and make the Babylonian Talmud the primary text? Well, first of all, it's unclear historically when exactly that decision was made, but it was made sometime in the post-Babylonian Talmudic period, in a period probably sometime before the 10th century, which is known as the Gaonic period. There were a lot of politics between the Jewish communities of the time, somewhere between the 6th and 10th centuries. There were a lot of politics in the growing communities that existed in both Palestine and Babylon. And as the community in Palestine, in Eretz Yisrael, began to wane, the communities in Bavel began to get stronger and stronger. And as a result, it was at that time when the Babylonian Talmud was adopted as the primary over the Jerusalem. Some therefore have argued, some scholars have argued, that inherently there is no greater superiority in the Babylonian Talmud over the Jerusalem Talmud, but for political expediencies, the Babylonian Talmud was adopted because the majority rule at the time was the Babylonian community. It was the home team, so to speak. But, okay, so as I said, there's a number of different interpretations. Okay, now, these two Talmuds contain an exposition of the text of the Mishnah, and an elucidation of the abstruse points and of the new subject matter that had been added by the various courts from the days of our teacher the saint until the compilation of the Talmud. The two Talmuds, the Tosefta, the Sifran the Sifri, and the Toseftot are the sources, I think he means the Braitot, are the sources from all of which is elucidated what is forbidden and what is permitted, what is unclean and what is clean, what is a penal violation and what involves no penalty, what is fit to be used and what is unfit for use, all in accordance with the traditions received by the sages from their predecessors in unbroken succession up to the teachings of Moses as he received them on Sinai. From these sources, too, are ascertained the decrees instituted by the sages and prophets in each generation to serve as a protecting fence about the law. In accordance with Moses' express injunction, you shall keep my charge, that is, ordain a charge to preserve my charge. And what this paragraph means is that in every generation, as I mentioned earlier, when a generation saw that there was an erosion of a particular law that was in danger of falling by the wayside, they would bolster the practice of that law by creating a fence around it. Going back to that one of the three teachings of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly, who said, make a fence around the Torah. Now let me just tell you, before I take the question, the men of the Great Assembly, I thought Maimonides was going to mention them, but he didn't. The men of the Great Assembly are great rabbinic sages who lived centuries before Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. They are the generation that follows the generation of the prophets. According to tradition, prophecy ceased in the first generation of the Jews' return to the land of Israel when they built the second temple in the times of Ezra and Nehemiah. And the last of the prophets were Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. The following generation no longer had prophets. There are reasons for that which involve metaphysics, which we won't go into now. But the very first generation of rabbinic leaders who themselves were not prophets were called the men of the Great Assembly. And they recognized that this was a new era where there was no more prophecy, where we could listen to God speaking to us. We would therefore have to be charged with a pure preservation of what had been given to us and not expect to receive any new information prophetically from God. Sources, a clear conception is also obtained of the customs and ordinances either formally introduced in various generations by their respective authorities or that came into use with their sanction. From these it is forbidden to depart, as it is said, thou shalt not turn aside from the sentence which they shall declare unto thee to the right hand or to the left. Torah says, lo tasur, you may not deviate from the rules which the rabbis give you, right or left, which means that even if they interpret a law and they tell you that this is what the Torah means, and you look at the text and you say, I don't think that's what it means, you are not permitted to deviate, because their transmission, their tradition, is much more authoritative than yours, because it's part of a tradition. Furthermore, you may not deviate if they give you a charge that is not contained in the Torah, but is rather a rabbinic law, going back to our example of not cooking chicken and milk. So too, these works contain the clearly established judgments and rules not received from Moses, but which the Supreme Court of each generation deduced by applying the hermeneutical principles for the interpretation of the law, and which are decided by those venerable authorities to be the law, all of which accumulated from the days of Moses to his own time, Rav Ashi put together in the Gemara. The Gemara is the term for the Babylonian Talmud. The sages of the Mishnah composed other works to expound the words of the Torah. Rabbi Hoshea, a disciple of our teacher, the saint, wrote an exposition of the book of Genesis. Rabbi Yishmael, a commentary on the Pentateuch, from the beginning of the book of Exodus to the end of the Pentateuch. This work is called Mechilta. Rabbi Akiva also wrote a Mechilta. Other sages who lived subsequently compiled Midrashim. Midrashim are texts that are based upon the 5 books of Moses, or the Tanakh really, and expound upon the meaning of the verses of Tanakh. All these works were composed before the Babylonian Talmud. Ravina and Ravashi and their colleagues were the last of the great sages who firmly established the oral law, made decrees and ordinances, and introduced customs. Their decrees, ordinances, and customs obtained universal acceptance among Israelites wherever they settled. After the court of Ravashi, who compiled the Gemara, which was finally completed in the days of his son, and an extraordinarily great dispersion of Israel throughout the world took place. The people emigrated to remote parts and distant isles. The prevalence of wars and the march of armies made travel insecure. The study of the Torah declined. The Jewish people did not flock to the colleges in their thousands and tens of thousands as heretofore. But in each city and country, individuals who felt the divine call gathered together and occupied themselves with the Torah, studied all the works of the sages, and from these learned the methods of legal interpretation. If a court established in any country after the time of the Talmud made decrees and ordinances, or introduced customs for those residing in its particular country or for residents of other countries, its enactments did not obtain the acceptance of all Israel because of the remoteness of the Jewish settlements and the difficulties of travel. And this is an important part of history. What are the two major divisions based on migration patterns in Jewish practice? What do you think? Ashkenazi and Sephardi. Those are the two major ones, but there are many more. There's Yemenite, there's Persian, right? There's Italian. Many, many different regional customs which have their own customs and practices and even halachic systems that build upon the rules of the Talmud but are local to those communities. And as the court of any particular country consisted of individuals whose authority was not universally recognized, while the Supreme Court of 71 members had several years before the compilation of the Talmud ceased to exist, no compulsion is exercised on those living in one country to observe the customs of another country. Nor is any court directed to issue a decree that had been issued by another court in the same country. So too, if one of the Gaonim, which was the name of the sages in the post-Talmudic era after the 6th century, taught that a certain way of judgment was correct, and it became clear to a court at a later date that this was not in accordance with the view of the Gemara, the earlier authority is not necessarily followed, but that view is adopted which seems more reasonable, whether it be that of an earlier or later authority. The foregoing observations refer to rules, decrees, ordinances, and customs that originated after the Talmud had been compiled. But whatever is already mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud is binding on all Israel. And every city and country is bound to observe all the customs observed by the sages of the Gemara, promulgate their decrees, and uphold their institutions on the ground that all these customs, decrees, and institutions mentioned in the Talmud received the assent of all Israel. And those sages who instituted the ordinances, issued the decrees, introduced the customs, gave the decisions, and taught that a certain ruling was correct, constituted the total body or the majority of Israel's wise men. They were the leaders who received from each other the traditions concerning the fundamentals of Judaism, in unbroken succession back to Moses, our teacher, upon whom be peace. The sages, however, who arose after the compilation of the Talmud studied it deeply and became famous for their wisdom. These are people who are called Gaonim. And the Gaonim flourished in the land of Israel, in Shinar, which is again the name of Babylon, Spain and France. They taught Talmudic methodology. And of course, as the Maimonides points out, different regions have different customs. And not only do they have different customs, but they have different ways of studying Torah, as has been exposited in many different texts. Now, I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the paragraph that says, they also made compilations, these Gaonim. They made compilations of settled rules as to things permitted or forbidden, as to infractions which were penal or were not liable to a penalty. All these dealt with matters in regard to which compendia were needed, that could be studied by one not capable of penetrating to the depths of the Talmud. This is the godly work in which all the Gaonim of Israel engaged, from the completion of the Talmud to the present date, which is the 8th year of the 11th century after the destruction of the Temple, namely 1177 of the Common Era. In our days, concludes Maimonides, severe vicissitudes prevail, and all feel the pressure of hard times. The wisdom of our wise men has disappeared. The understanding of our prudent men is hidden. Hence, the commentaries of the Gaonim and their compilations of laws and responses, which they took care to make clear, have in our times become hard to understand, so that only a few individuals properly comprehend them. Needless to add that such is the case in regard to the Talmud itself, the Babylonian as well as the Palestinian, the Sifra, the Sifri, and the Tosefta, all of which works require for their comprehension a broad mind, a wise soul, and considerable study, and only then one can learn from them the correct practice as to what is forbidden or permitted and the other rules of the Torah. The Maimonides goes on for another few paragraphs. In those few paragraphs, he is writing a justification for the writing of his work called the Mishneh Torah, because you see where he's going with this. Because these ancient texts have become more difficult to understand in ensuing generations, I need to give you now the contemporary authoritative text, which I will present in codified form. One of the reasons why Maimonides was severely criticized in subsequent generations, early on in the medieval period, is because he had the chutzpah to change the format of study. Codification is a Greek method. It is not a Jewish method. What do I mean by codification? Do you all know what I mean by codification? What I mean is paragraph 1, sentence 1. Paragraph 1, sentence 2. Paragraph 1, sentence 3. Right? That's a Greek method of labeling each sentence, each rule, each law, and putting it into categories. We'll study some portions of Talmud, and as you'll see, the discussions in the Talmud are not in codified form. It's a cadence and flow. It's an organic conversation that one rabbi says to the other rabbi, this is the law. And the other rabbi says, well, how can that be the law if such and such? And the other one says, well, that's not a problem because of this. And then the other rabbi says, yes, but what about that? And the other one says, yes. And they go back and forth until the conversation is exhausted. And that's not the way Maimonides felt was an effective way for the contemporary generation to be able to deduce what the law is. It's too confusing, too difficult to finally get to the bottom line. And that's why he codified Jewish law and called it Mishneh Torah. Another reason why he was criticized is because there were many ambiguities about the finality of the law, because there were many, remember, the Talmud is completed around the 5th century with Ravina and Ravashi. Maimonides doesn't live until the 12th century. You've got about 700 years of discussions of what does the Talmud mean exactly, and what should the law be in this instance. What does the Talmud really say? And Maimonides, instead of presenting the 2 or 3 or 4 possible explanations, he chose what he felt was most correct and inserted it as the final rule. So he took a lot of heat for that, because there were many rabbis who were critical to say, what right do you, Maimonides, have to be the final arbiter on what Jewish law should be for all communities of Israel? Despite your brilliance, you have to acknowledge that not everyone agrees that your interpretation is correct. But that was his project nonetheless. And it was probably one of the most successful projects of his time and probably of the entire medieval Jewish endeavor in scholarship. So that's just about all we have time for tonight. Let's just review what we've learned, and then we'll let you go. We've learned that when we talk about Torah Shebe'al Peh, we mean a transmission of information that was originally meant to remain oral in order to preserve a process of education from generation to generation, which by definition cannot be purely textual, in order for it to be preserved. We then learned that Torah Shebe'al Peh, at some point in Jewish history, at least a portion of it was written down in a universal text that was accepted by all of Israel, and that we call the Mishnah. It doesn't mean that that's the totality of the oral tradition, but a certain amount of words were used to present in the most terse form what the law is. That was done in the 2nd century by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, known as Rabbeinu, our master or our teacher. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's students continued his project with the writing of other texts that further expanded upon Rebbe's project. Texts like the Sifra, the Sifri, the Tosefta, the Mechilta, etc. in ensuing generations, there were even more texts that were committed to writing. We have the Jerusalem Talmud, and then later, finally, the Babylonian Talmud. When we study Talmud today, by and large, we're referring to the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud contains the full text of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's Mishnah, and it contains the Babylonian Talmud, which is an explanation of the Mishnah. And there you have it. Next time we're going to talk about the Tzuras Hadath, hermeneutical methodology. I'll give you some more information as well about the structure of the Mishnah and of the Talmud Bavli. Okay? Any questions? Yes?
So if they didn't like that the Rambam decided that this is the halacha, how did they at that point conduct themselves? What is the halacha?
Well, there were contemporaries of the Rambam who sometimes would agree with him and sometimes wrote their own texts to say, here's where I disagree.
So the population followed who?
Every community followed its rabbinic leaders. So if you were living in the Rhineland, for example, you didn't necessarily have to follow Maimonides, who was living in Egypt and was more of an arbiter for Sephardic Jewry. But you could follow one of the Tosafist rabbis. There was a Tosafist Academy. It was known as the Tosafist Academy. They lived in the Rhineland, in Germany and France. And they sometimes interpreted the law.
Different, the
Many times the interpretations were vastly different. Yes?
The hermeneutical rules, they were used to interpret the Tanakh?
They are used to interpret verses from Tanakh and translate them into law. Okay? So we'll see you, God willing, next time. Okay.